They came to Earth with their polished armor gleaming under foreign suns, their technology centuries beyond anything we had dreamed possible, and their certainty absolute. The Valerian Collective had watched us from the shadows of space for 3 generations, documenting our wars, our conflicts, our endless capacity for self-destruction. They had seen our cities burn, our people fall, our civilizations crumble under the weight of our own making. And in their council chambers, orbiting distant stars, they had reached a unanimous conclusion. Humanity was weak. Fragile. Unworthy of the galaxy that awaited beyond our small blue world. They came not as conquerors, but as saviors, offering us a place in their grand alliance against a threat that made our petty conflicts look like children squabbling in sandboxes. The Devourers were coming, a force of biological horror that consumed worlds and left nothing but silence in their wake. The Collective needed soldiers, bodies to throw against the endless tide, and they believed they were offering us poor, pathetic humans a gift. An opportunity to die for something greater than ourselves. Commander Thelkor stood in the recruitment center in what used to be New York, his 4 eyes scanning the crowd of humans who had gathered to hear the Valerian offer. He had personally overseen recruitment on 17 worlds, each one more promising than this backwater planet of emotional primitives. The humans before him were small, their bodies lacking the dense muscle structure of Krell warriors, the chitinous armor of Skrix defenders, the regenerative capabilities of Morphean shock troops. They were soft, with their thin skin and vulnerable organs, their short lifespans and limited strength. Some of them were barely adults by galactic standards, their faces unmarked by the scars of true combat. Others were older, carrying the weight of years in bodies that would never match the enhanced physiology of proper soldiers. Thelkor felt something close to pity as he activated the translation matrix and began his standard recruitment speech. He told them of glory, of purpose, of standing against the darkness that threatened all sentient life. He did not tell them that the survival rate for auxiliary troops was less than 30%. He did not tell them that humans would be assigned to the most desperate fronts, the positions too costly for valuable collective citizens. He did not tell them that their weakness was precisely why they had been chosen. What happened next would echo through the collective for generations. The humans did not hesitate. They did not demand better equipment or question their deployment. A young woman stepped forward, her hands calloused from labor, her eyes carrying a weight that Thelkor's scanners could not measure. She asked only one question, her voice steady despite the fear he could smell on her skin. "When do we start?" Behind her, thousands more stood waiting, and in that moment, the commander felt the first whisper of something he would later recognize as doubt. These creatures, these fragile beings of flesh and bone, were volunteering for what he knew would be slaughter. They understood the stakes, he could see it in their faces, yet still they came. It was not bravery, Thelkor told himself. It was simply that they did not fully comprehend what awaited them in the black between stars. They would learn soon enough. They would break, as all weak things break, and the collective would continue on without them. This was the natural order. This was inevitable. The first human regiment shipped out 3 weeks later, 5,000 souls packed into transport vessels designed for species twice their size. Thelkor watched them go, already composing his report on projected casualties. He estimated that fewer than 1,000 would survive their first engagement. The Devourers were massing near the Chiron sector, and someone had to hold the line while the collective's elite forces prepared their counteroffensive. The humans would do this. They would die doing this. And the galaxy would barely notice their passing. What the commander did not know, what none of the collective's leaders could have predicted, was that humanity had been preparing for this moment since the first of our ancestors looked up at the stars and wondered what waited in the darkness. We had been forged in the fires of our own making, tempered by centuries of conflict and catastrophe, shaped by every war, every loss, every impossible victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. We were not the strongest species. We were not the fastest or the most advanced. But we were the ones who had survived ourselves, and that made all the difference. The Chiron sector was dying when the human transports arrived. 3 collective worlds had already fallen, their populations consumed, their cities reduced to organic matter that fed the endless hunger of the devourer swarm. The defensive line was collapsing, elite Krell shock battalions retreating in formations that their doctrine had never anticipated needing. The devourers were not like any enemy the collective had faced before. They did not negotiate, did not retreat, did not feel fear or pain or mercy. They simply came, wave after wave of chittering horror, and they consumed everything in their path. The collective forces were disciplined, well-trained, equipped with weapons that could level mountains. But they were also calculating, their commanders weighing every decision against the cost of irreplaceable lives and advanced equipment. When the math stopped making sense, they withdrew. This was logical. This was survival. The humans were assigned to Firebase Dante, a hastily constructed defensive position on a worthless moon that held strategic value only as a delay mechanism. If the devourers stopped to consume the garrison there, it would buy the collective fleet time to reposition. No one expected the Firebase to hold for more than a few hours. No one expected the humans to even try. Captain Sarah Chen stood in a command bunker, looking at tactical displays that told her everything she needed to know about her situation. She had 2,300 soldiers, most of them fresh from basic training that had been compressed from months into weeks. She had enough ammunition for perhaps 6 hours of sustained combat. She had no air support, no orbital bombardment capabilities, no evacuation plan. Behind her, Lieutenant Marcus Williams studied the same data, his jaw tight. "They sent us here to die," he said quietly, and it was not a question. Sarah turned to face him, to face all of them, these young men and women who had volunteered for this, who had left behind families and futures for a war that was not their own. "Yeah," she said. "They did." What happened next would be studied in collective military academies for the next 1,000 years. Sarah did not order a retreat that would never come. She did not waste time on false hope or empty reassurances. Instead, she gathered her officers and began to plan. Not for survival, but for maximum impact. The humans had been given a mission, however cynical its true purpose, and they would complete it. When the devourers came, they came in numbers that blotted out the stars, a living tide of claws and teeth and hunger that had ended civilizations. The Firebase's automated defenses activated, cutting down the first waves with mechanical efficiency. The devourers did not slow. They climbed over their own dead, adapting, learning, pushing forward with the patience of geological time and the ferocity of wildfire. The collective had calculated that the humans would break when they saw what was coming for them. They were wrong. Corporal James Rodriguez was 19 years old when he took his position on the Firebase's outer wall. He had lied about his age to enlist, desperate to be part of something greater than the dying streets of Mexico City. Beside him, Private Aisha Okonkwo checked her rifle for the 7th time, her hands steady despite the trembling she felt inside. She had been a teacher before this, had spent her days trying to give children hope in a world that seemed to have run out of it. Now she stood on an alien moon, waiting for monsters, and she thought of those children and prayed they would never have to do what she was about to do. The first devourer that crested the wall was 3 meters of armored horror, its multiple limbs ending in blades that could cut through steel. James shot it in what he hoped was its head. It kept coming. Aisha fired, her rounds punching through its thorax. It stumbled. A dozen more weapons joined theirs, and the creature fell. Behind it came 1,000 more. The battle for Firebase Dante lasted not hours, but 3 days. The humans fought with a ferocity that shocked the collective observers monitoring from orbit. When their ammunition ran low, they fixed bayonets. When the walls were breached, they fought in the corridors. When the corridors became untenable, they rigged explosives and collapsed entire sections, buying minutes with their lives. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. They adapted with a speed that seemed impossible, learning the devourer's weaknesses, exploiting every advantage their smaller size and tactical flexibility offered. Sarah Chen died on the 2nd day, leading a counterattack to retake a munitions depot. Her last words, recorded by her combat helmet, were orders to hold the line. Marcus Williams took command and never stopped moving, appearing wherever the line was weakest, rallying soldiers who had every reason to break and no reason to stand except that standing was what humans did. When the collective relief force finally arrived, they found Firebase Dante still holding, manned by fewer than 300 survivors out of the original 2,300. The moon around the firebase was carpeted with devourer corpses, thousands upon thousands of them, a testament written in chitin and ichor. The humans had held for 72 hours against an enemy that had broken collective lines in minutes. They had inflicted casualties at a ratio that military analysts initially refused to believe. And when the rescue ships landed, when collective medics rushed forward to treat the wounded, they found soldiers still at their posts, still scanning for targets, still ready to fight. Commander Thelkor stood in the ruins of the firebase and felt his certainty crumble. These weak creatures, these fragile beings he had pitted, had accomplished what his finest troops had deemed impossible. And they had done it not with superior technology or enhanced physiology, but with something the collective had forgotten how to quantify. The will to stand when standing meant death. The refusal to break when breaking was the logical choice. The stubborn, furious insistence that some things mattered more than survival. The news of Firebase Dante spread through the collective like electricity through water, touching everything, changing everything. Military commanders who had dismissed human auxiliaries as expendable began requesting their deployment. Scientists who had catalogued humanity's physical limitations started studying something they could not measure in laboratories. Politicians who had never bothered to learn Earth's location suddenly wanted to understand what drove these strange beings to fight like demons for a cause that was not their own. The collective had conquered the galaxy through superior technology and coordinated strategy, but they had forgotten something essential in their rise to power. They had forgotten what it meant to fight not because victory was probable, but because surrender was unthinkable. The humans remembered. It was written into every fiber of their being, coded into their culture by 10,000 years of struggling against a universe that did not care if they lived or died. General Carvex of the Collective Military Council called an emergency session to address what they were now calling the human variable. Holographic displays showed Firebase Dante from 100 angles, showing humans doing things that should not have been possible. A soldier with both legs shattered dragging herself to a firing position. A medic running into crossfire to reach a wounded comrade. A demolitions expert manually detonating charges because the remote trigger had failed, his final act buying his squad the seconds they needed to escape. They fight like they're already dead, Carvex said, his translator struggling with the emotion in his voice. They accept casualties that would break any rational force and continue fighting. How do we classify this? How do we plan around it? The council had no answers, because the collective had spent millennia removing such inefficient traits from their member species. Fear was managed through genetic modification. Grief was processed through neural adjustment. The pain of loss was dampened by pharmaceutical intervention. The collective had engineered away the very things that made humans dangerous, and in doing so, they had made themselves safe. Predictable. Controllable. Weak in ways they had never recognized. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos became the first human to address a collective military briefing, standing before officers whose species had reached the stars before humanity had invented agriculture. She was small by their standards, her combat armor scarred and patched, her face marked by burns from a plasma grenade that had nearly killed her on Firebase Dante. She had been asked to explain human combat doctrine, to help the collective understand how her species achieved results that violated their models of warfare. Maria looked at the assembled generals and admirals, these beings who commanded fleets and armies beyond comprehension, and she told them the truth. "We fight for each other," she said simply. "Not for the collective, not for Earth, not for some abstract idea of victory. We fight because the person next to us is fighting, and we'll be damned if we let them fight alone. You want to understand us? Understand that. We're not better soldiers than you. We're just too stubborn to quit on our friends. The silence that followed was profound. Then a Krell admiral, his species known for their unshakable courage in battle, rose to his full 3-meter height. "This is not a weakness," he said slowly, his translator catching the wonder in his voice. "This is what we have lost." The collective had built its military on the principle of acceptable losses, on strategic withdrawal when the cost exceeded the benefit, on the cold calculation of resources versus results. They had created a machine of war that was efficient, powerful, and ultimately limited by its own rationality. The humans had no such limitations. They fought with the illogical ferocity of beings who measured victory not in territory gained or casualties inflicted, but in promises kept to the person beside them. They could not be broken by losses because loss only made them fight harder. They could not be intimidated by impossible odds because impossible was just another word for difficult. And they could not be made to abandon each other, even when abandonment was the tactically sound decision. Within weeks, human integration into collective forces accelerated from auxiliary support to full partnership. The Fifth Fleet, defending the critical Nexar approaches, requested a full human brigade to supplement their Skrix defenders. The request was approved, and Brigadier General Thomas Adeyemi led his troops into a meat grinder that had already consumed 2 collective divisions. The Devourers were adapting, learning from each engagement, developing new forms specifically designed to counter collective tactics. But they had never fought humans before, had never encountered an enemy that treated doctrine as suggestion rather than law, that improvised and innovated with a speed born of desperation and creativity. When the Devourers deployed acid spitters that dissolved Skrix chitin, the humans responded with makeshift shields fabricated from hull plating. When biomines turned the battlefield into a minefield of living explosives, human engineers cleared paths with controlled detonations that their collective counterparts insisted were suicidally reckless. When a Devourer broodmother emerged, a creature the size of a frigate that could birth warriors in real time, a human pilot named Captain Jennifer Zhao flew her damaged fighter directly into its spawning chamber and detonated her remaining missiles manually. The Nexar held, and with it, the Eastern Front stabilized. But the cost was written in names and faces, in letters sent home to a planet that seemed impossibly distant, in the quiet moments between battles when soldiers who had laughed together yesterday realized that tomorrow would come without voices they had learned to depend on. The collective began to understand that human strength was inseparable from human grief, that the same bonds that made them formidable also made them vulnerable in ways that transcended physical injury. A Valerian psychologist named Tmar began studying what humans called post-traumatic stress, a condition that the collective's medical science had eliminated from their own species generations ago. What she found disturbed her. Human soldiers carried their dead with them, remembered every face, every name, every loss with a clarity that would cripple most collective species. Yet somehow, they continued. They mourned, they broke, they suffered under weights that should have destroyed them, and then they stood up and returned to the line. Not because the pain had lessened, but because their friends were still fighting, still dying, still holding positions that needed to be held. "They are killing themselves to save us," Mar reported to the council, her voice shaking with an emotion that her species had bred away centuries ago. "And they do it gladly, not because they do not fear death, but because they fear abandoning each other more than they fear dying. We asked them to be soldiers, and they have shown us what soldiers truly are. We asked them to fight, and they have reminded us what it means to fight for something beyond survival. We thought they were weak because they feel too much, because they care too deeply, because they cannot let go of their dead. We were wrong. Those things are not weaknesses. They are the very source of their strength, and we have nothing comparable in all the collective." The turning point came at the Battle of Threshold Gate, where the Devourers made their final push toward collective core worlds. Intelligence had tracked the swarm's movements for weeks, watching as they consolidated forces into a single overwhelming strike. The gate itself was a marvel of ancient engineering, a stable wormhole maintained by technology that the collective had inherited but never fully understood. If it fell, the Devourers would have direct access to 17 heavily populated systems. The defense of Threshold Gate was assigned to the entire collective Second Army, 200,000 of the finest soldiers from a dozen species. They were supported by orbital fortifications that could vaporize moons, by ships that had never known defeat, by weapons that bent the laws of physics to their will. And they were reinforced by 12,000 humans, such a small percentage of the total force that many commanders questioned why they were included at all. Colonel David Park commanded the human contingent, a man whose quiet demeanor hid a tactical mind that had been forged in the crucible of Firebase Dante and a dozen battles since. He studied the defensive positions and saw immediately what the collective commanders, for all their sophistication, had missed. They were planning to fight a conventional battle, to hold fixed positions with overwhelming firepower, to trade space for time in an orderly retreat if necessary. It was sound strategy against a rational opponent. The Devourers were not rational. They were hunger given form, and they would not stop, would not slow, would not accept any outcome except total victory or total annihilation. David requested a meeting with Supreme Commander Yul Tresh, a Valerian general whose career spanned 3 centuries. He brought his senior officers, men and women whose faces were already too familiar with loss. With respect, Commander, David said, standing before a being who had commanded armies before humanity had left its own solar system, your defensive plan will fail. The silence in the command center was absolute. Junior officers from a dozen species stared in shock at this human who dared to question Yul Tresh, whose strategic genius was taught in military academies across the galaxy. But Yul Tresh did not respond with anger. He had fought alongside humans now, had seen what they could do, had learned to listen when they spoke of war. Explain, he said simply. David activated a tactical display, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. You're planning for an enemy that cares about casualties, that will withdraw when losses become unsustainable. The Devourers don't care. They'll throw everything they have at your fixed positions until they break through. And they will break through, because you're thinking like soldiers who want to survive the battle. They're thinking like a plague that doesn't care if individual infections die, only that the host is consumed. He paused, looking around the room at faces that were beginning to understand. You need to fight them like humans fight. You need to be willing to sacrifice everything at the critical moment, to hold when holding is suicide, to hit them where it hurts even if it costs you everything you have. What followed was 48 hours of intensive planning, as human tactical doctrine merged with collective technology in ways that neither had imagined possible. The collective would provide the firepower, the advanced weapons, the strategic coordination that their centuries of military evolution had perfected. The humans would provide something that could not be taught or programmed or enhanced through technology. They would provide the willingness to stand in the fire and hold the line until the fire consumed them, if that was what victory required. When the Devourers came, they came with numbers that blotted out sensors, a biomass so vast that it generated its own gravity. The first wave hit the outer defenses with the force of a tidal wave, and the carefully prepared kill zones turned into abattoirs of chitin and ichor. The collective forces fought with precision and power, their weapons cutting through the swarm with devastating efficiency. But still the Devourers came, adapting, evolving, pushing forward with the inevitability of entropy itself. The eastern defensive grid failed on hour 6, overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Collective protocol called for strategic withdrawal to secondary positions. The human regiment assigned to that sector did not receive the withdrawal order, or if they did, they chose not to follow it. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, 24 years old and 3 months out of officer training, stood in a bunker that was rapidly becoming a tomb and made a decision that would echo through history. She opened a channel to her company, to the 200 soldiers who looked to her for leadership, and she gave them a choice. We can fall back, she said, her voice steady despite everything. Command would understand. We've done our part. Or we can stay, and we can hold this position long enough for the collective to reinforce the secondary line. If we stay, we're probably not getting out. I need you to understand that. But if we go, the Devourers get through, and everything we've fought for, everyone we've lost, it all means nothing. The response came not in words but in the sound of weapons being loaded, positions being reinforced, soldiers digging in for a stand that they knew would be their last. Sarah felt tears on her face and did not wipe them away. "All right then," she said. "Let's show them what humans do when the choice is between abandoning our friends and dying with them. Let's show them that we're not afraid of death. We're just afraid of not matching." The eastern sector held for 18 more hours, far beyond any logical projection, far beyond what should have been possible. The Devourers threw everything they had at positions manned by soldiers who should have broken, should have fled, should have chosen survival over a futile stand. But humans had never been good at choosing survival when their friends needed them to fight. When collective reinforcements finally retook the eastern sector, they found it carpeted with bodies, human and devourer alike, and in the center of the carnage, they found a flag. Not a collective banner, but an old Earth flag, torn and burned and still flying, held aloft by Sarah Kim's body in a position that suggested her last act had been to ensure it did not fall. The Battle of Threshold Gate lasted 2 weeks, and when it was over, the Devourer assault had been broken. The swarm, for the first time in its recorded history, retreated, withdrawing to regroup and reassess. Collective analysts estimated that without the human contribution, particularly their willingness to hold critical positions beyond all reasonable limits, the gate would have fallen on day 3. 12,000 humans had deployed to Threshold Gate. 4,300 came home. But they came home victorious, and they came home with the respect of every soldier in the collective who had witnessed what they had done. General Yaltresh stood before the survivors at the memorial service, his alien features unable to hide his emotion. "I have commanded armies for longer than your species has had written language," he said. "I have seen courage and I have seen sacrifice. But I have never seen what you showed us here. You fought not because you were ordered to, not because you were enhanced or programmed or genetically designed for war. You fought because you chose to, because someone had to, because your friends needed you. And in doing so, you reminded us all why we fight, what we fight for, and what it truly means to be a warrior." The war against the Devourers continued for 3 more years, but the Battle of Threshold Gate marked the moment when the tide truly turned. Human tactical doctrine, once viewed as reckless and emotionally driven, was integrated into collective military strategy at every level. Elite units that had once scoffed at the notion of fighting alongside primitives now requested human liaison officers, sought their input on defensive planning, studied their adaptability and innovation. The collective had spent millennia perfecting the science of warfare, but the humans had something that could not be perfected or optimized or enhanced through technology. They had the art of war, the understanding that battles were won not just through superior firepower but through the human spirit's refusal to accept defeat when acceptance meant abandoning those who depended on you. Captain James Rodriguez, one of the Firebase Dante survivors, found himself training Krell shock troops in what the collective was now calling adaptive resilience doctrine. He stood before soldiers who could crush him with one hand, whose natural armor could withstand weapons that would vaporize him, and taught them something their species had forgotten. "Fear is not your enemy," he told them. "Fear keeps you alive, makes you think, makes you human. Well, makes you sentient. The trick is not to eliminate fear but to act despite it. To stand when every instinct screams at you to run, because the person next to you is counting on you to stand. That's not bravery. That's just, being there for your people." A Krell warrior named Thrak Nor, a veteran of 50 engagements, raised one massive claw. "But our doctrine teaches us to calculate risk, to withdraw when the probability of success falls below acceptable thresholds. You are teaching us to ignore probability." James smiled, and there was something in that smile that made even the towering Krell pause. "I'm teaching you that some things matter more than probability. I'm teaching you that sometimes the right choice is the one that gets you killed, and you make it anyway because it's right." The transformation was not limited to military doctrine. The collective's entire understanding of strength, of capability, of what made a species valuable to the galactic community began to shift. Humanity's weaknesses, their emotional volatility, their tendency toward irrational attachment, their inability to optimize away the pain of loss, were recontextualized as the very traits that made them formidable. The collective had achieved stability by removing the extremes of emotion, the highs and lows that made life unpredictable. But in doing so, they had also removed the capacity for the kind of desperate courage that turned impossible situations into victories, the kind of fierce loyalty that made soldiers fight beyond all rational limits, the kind of stubborn hope that refused to accept that some battles could not be won. Earth became a pilgrimage site for collective soldiers, who traveled across the galaxy to visit the world that had produced these remarkable warriors. They walked through museums that displayed humanity's bloody history, saw exhibits on wars fought with primitive weapons for causes that seemed incomprehensible to species that had evolved past such conflicts. And they began to understand that humanity's strength came not despite their history of violence and loss, but because of it. Dr. Tmar, the Valerian psychologist who had first studied human trauma responses, published a groundbreaking paper titled The Paradox of Human Resilience. In it, she argued that humanity's capacity for suffering was inseparable from their capacity for extraordinary achievement. They feel everything more intensely than we do, she wrote. Their grief cuts deeper, their fear runs stronger, their pain is more profound. We evolved to dampen these responses, to protect ourselves from their weight. Humans evolved to carry them, to continue functioning under burdens that would crush our psyches. This is not a flaw in their design. This is their design. They are built to endure what should be unendurable, to continue when continuation should be impossible, to hope when hope itself is irrational. We called them weak because they cry for their fallen, because they carry their losses like open wounds. But those tears are not weakness. They are the price they pay for bonds strong enough to make them fight like demons for each other. Those wounds are not weakness. They are proof that they care enough about their comrades to be hurt by their loss. And that caring, that capacity to be wounded by loss and fight anyway, is the source of everything that makes them formidable. The final battle against the Devourers came at a place humans would name Hope's End, a barren system with no strategic value except that it was where the swarm had chosen to make it stand. Every species of the collective was represented in the fleet that assembled there, the largest military force ever gathered in galactic history. But standing at the forefront, leading the assault that would determine the fate of countless worlds, were the humans. They numbered in the hundreds of thousands now, volunteers from a world that had given more than any other species to this war. They stood ready not because they were the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced, but because they had proven, time and again, that they would fight for the galaxy with the same fierce determination they had once turned against each other. Admiral Chen, Sarah's younger sister who had joined the service after Firebase Dante, commanded the human fleet contingent from the bridge of the UCSS Indomitable, a ship built by human hands with collective technology. She looked at the tactical display showing the Devourer forces, at odds that still made veteran commanders nervous, and she thought of her sister. Of Marcus Williams and James Rodriguez and Aisha Okonkwo and all the others who had stood at Firebase Dante and shown the galaxy what humans could do. All ships, she said quietly, her voice carrying to every human vessel in the fleet. We've shown them that we're not weak. Now let's show them that we're not done. The Battle of Hope's End raged for 36 hours, and when it was over, the Devourer threat had been ended. Not diminished, not pushed back, but ended, their central consciousness destroyed, their ability to coordinate and adapt broken beyond repair. The victory came at terrible cost. 17 collective worlds scarred by the fighting. Millions of casualties across dozens of species. And 30,000 humans who would never see Earth again, who had given everything they had for a galaxy that had once dismissed them as primitives. But they had won, and in winning, they had fundamentally changed what the collective understood about strength, about courage, about the value of species that felt too much and cared too deeply and refused to accept that some fights could not be won. Commander Thelkor, who had first recruited humans into the collective military, stood at the memorial service on Earth where names were being carved into a monument that would span kilometers before it was complete. He had been wrong about so many things. Wrong to think that emotional attachment was weakness. Wrong to believe that physical limitations determined combat effectiveness. Wrong to assume that a species that spent so much of its history fighting itself could not fight for others with equal ferocity. A young girl approached him during the service, no more than 10 years old, holding a photograph of a woman in military uniform. "That's my mom," she said, showing him the picture. "She died at Threshold Gate. They said she was a hero." Felkor looked at the child, at her eyes that already knew too much about loss, at the photograph of a woman who had given everything for people she had never met, on a world she would never see. "Yes," he said, his translator struggling with the emotion in his voice. "She was. They all were. And I am sorry that my species did not understand that sooner, did not realize what we were asking of yours until you had already given it." The girl considered this, her small face serious beyond her years. "My teacher says that humans are the strongest species in the galaxy now. Is that true?" Felkor thought about how to answer, about everything he had learned in the years since that first recruitment speech. "In the ways that truly matter," he said finally, "yes. Your species is the strongest. Not because you cannot be broken, but because you refuse to stay broken. Not because you do not feel fear or pain or loss, but because you fight despite those feelings, because of those feelings. You love fiercely, you grieve deeply, and you stand for each other when standing seems impossible. That is not weakness. That is strength of a kind the rest of us had forgotten existed." Years later, when the collective had rebuilt, when the scars of war had begun to heal, humanity took its place not as auxiliaries or junior partners but as full equals in an alliance that had been transformed by their presence. The galaxy had learned that strength could not be measured only in technology or physical capability, that the most formidable warriors were not those who had been engineered to perfection but those who chose to fight despite their imperfections, who stood for each other when standing meant sacrifice, who carried their losses as reminders of why they fought rather than reasons to stop fighting. The universe was vast and dangerous, filled with threats that made the devourers seem like a prelude to darker things waiting in the spaces between stars. But the collective faced those threats now with something they had lacked before, something that could not be manufactured or programmed or enhanced through genetic modification. They faced them with hope, with the stubborn human refusal to accept that any battle was unwinnable, any stand impossible, any cause lost as long as someone was still willing to fight for it. And at the heart of every fleet, in the vanguard of every army, standing ready to do what they had always done, were the humans. The species the galaxy had once called weak, who had proven that true strength was measured not in what you could endure without breaking, but in your willingness to break and fight anyway, to fall and rise again, to lose everything and still find reasons to hope, to love, to stand for those who stood beside you. They had thought we were weak because we felt too much. They learned we were strong because we felt everything and fought anyway. This was humanity's gift to the galaxy. This was what we had been preparing for through all our bloody, beautiful, terrible history. This was why we were here.